The childhood crime that shocked the world. The truth that has finally come to light. Mary Bell, 1968. Britannica sentenced to 200 years in prison for murdering her parents while they slept. She was only 11 years old. Newcastle, England, May 1968. A working-class city awoke to a nightmare that would challenge everything British society believed about childhood innocence. The body of Martin Brown, just 4 years old, was found in an abandoned house in Scotswood, a poor and neglected neighborhood. Initially, authorities treated it as a tragic accident, a fatal fall. Nothing more. But what they didn't know was that a predator's eyes were watching every move of the investigation, and those eyes belonged to a girl who was only 10 years old. Mary Flora Bell was not an ordinary child. With blonde hair and piercing blue eyes, she possessed a smile that concealed something disturbing, something that even the adults around her couldn't fully decipher. Born on May 26, 1957, into a family destroyed by poverty and neglect, Mary grew up in an environment where love was replaced by violence, abuse, and abandonment. Her mother, Betty Bell, was a prostitute with a history of mental instability. Rumors whispered that Betty had tried to kill her own daughter several times as a baby, disguising the attempts as accidents. Mary survived, but something inside her died in those early years. On the morning of May 25, 1968, one day before her 11th birthday, Mary woke up with a strange sensation. It wasn't anxiety about her birthday. It was something darker, more urgent. She watched through the dirty window of her miserable apartment the children playing in the streets of Scotswood. Among them, Martin Brown, a cheerful boy with dark hair and rosy cheeks. Something about him caught Mary's attention. Perhaps it was his vulnerability. Perhaps it was the way his mother hugged him tenderly, a tenderness Mary had never known. That afternoon, Mary convinced Martin to accompany her to a nearby abandoned house. "I'll show you something cool," she said with that angelic smile that deceived everyone. Martin, innocent and trusting, followed her without hesitation. What happened inside those decaying walls would remain a mystery for decades, but the result was undeniable. Martin Brown was found dead hours later, his small body lying on the floor, strange marks on his neck barely visible. Detective Inspector James Dobson arrived at the scene with a heavy heart. A father himself, he couldn't comprehend how such a young child could die in such circumstances. The preliminary examination showed no obvious signs of foul play, no blood, no apparent struggle. The pathologist ruled it as possibly accidental, perhaps a fall that caused internal injuries. But Dobson felt something was off. The position of the body seemed arranged, and there were those faint marks on the neck that nobody could quite explain. Could have been from playing, the pathologist suggested. Children roughhouse all the time. Dobson wasn't convinced, but without evidence, what could he do? The community of Scotswood was already traumatized. Parents held their children closer that night, whispering prayers and checking locks. Meanwhile, Mary Bell sat at her window, watching. The police cars drive away, a strange excitement coursing through her veins. She had done something adults couldn't understand. She had power, and she wanted more. The day after Martin's death, something bizarre happened that should have raised immediate red flags. Mary Bell and her friend Norma Bell, no relation, broke into a nursery school in Scotswood. They vandalized the place, scattering toys and supplies everywhere. But what chilled investigators later was what they found written on the walls in crude, childish handwriting. Notes about Martin Brown, mocking his death, claiming responsibility, and cryptic messages that seemed like dark jokes. "I murder so that I may come back," read one note. "We did murder Martin Brown," stated another. The police dismissed it as a sick prank by teenagers trying to create hysteria. They couldn't fathom that the author might be an 11-year-old girl who had actually committed the crime. Mary Bell had done something extraordinary in her twisted mind. She had returned to taunt them, to prove her superiority, to relish in the chaos she had created. But Mary's hunger wasn't satisfied. The thrill of taking Martin's life had awakened something insatiable within her. She needed to feel that power again, that godlike control over life and death. And in the grim streets of Scotswood, vulnerable children were everywhere. For nearly 3 months, an uneasy peace settled over Scotswood. Parents began to relax slightly. The death of Martin Brown, while tragic, was filed away as a terrible accident. Life went on as it always did in working-class Newcastle. Fathers worked the shipyards, mothers struggled to feed their families, and children played in the streets because there was nowhere else to go. Mary Bell attended school, played with other children, and to all outward appearances seemed like any other girl in the neighborhood. Teachers noted she was intelligent but troubled, often acting out or displaying concerning behavior. She would hurt other children seemingly without remorse, then smile innocently when confronted. But in 1968, such behavior was often dismissed as being a difficult child, rather than a warning sign of something far more sinister. What nobody knew was that Mary was planning, watching, selecting her next victim with the cold calculation of a seasoned predator. And when July came, bringing with it the warm summer days when children played outside until dark, Mary Bell would strike again, and this time, the evidence would be impossible to ignore. July 31st, 1968. The summer heat hung heavy over Scotswood like a suffocating blanket. Children sought relief anywhere they could find it, in the shade of crumbling buildings, in makeshift games that kept their minds off the oppressive temperature. Among them was Brian Howe, a gentle 3-year-old boy with innocent brown eyes and a trusting nature that made him beloved by everyone in the neighborhood. He was smaller than other children his age, vulnerable, an easy target. Mary Bell had been watching Brian for weeks. She studied his routines, noted when he played alone, observed how his mother would sometimes lose sight of him when talking to neighbors. On that fateful afternoon, Mary saw her opportunity. Brian was playing on a patch of wasteland between 2 demolished houses, building small towers with rocks and pieces of brick. He was alone. Want to play a game? Mary's voice was sweet, melodic even. Brian looked up and smiled. He knew Mary from the neighborhood. She was older, which made her seem important, trustworthy. Okay. Brian's voice was filled with the pure joy only a child can possess, untainted by the knowledge of evil that walks among us. Mary took his small hand in hers. To anyone watching, it would have looked like an older child kindly looking after a younger one. But there were no witnesses this time. Mary had learned from her first kill. She led Brian to a more secluded area, behind concrete blocks that hid them from view. What happened next would horrify the world when the details finally emerged. Mary Bell didn't just kill Brian Howe. She tortured him. Using scissors she had hidden in her pocket, she mutilated the child's body in ways that defied comprehension. She carved an M into his stomach. She cut off patches of his hair. She punctured his thighs. And most disturbingly, she attempted to castrate him with the scissors, a detail so shocking that even hardened detectives would struggle to discuss it. But the physical mutilation wasn't the most chilling aspect. Witnesses would later testify that they saw Mary return to Brian's body multiple times over the next few hours. She would check on it, admire her work, even rearrange the body position. At one point, she brought Norma Bell to see what she had done, showing it off like a twisted trophy. "Don't tell anyone," Mary warned Norma, her blue eyes cold and threatening, "or I'll do the same to you." Norma, terrified and traumatized, kept silent for hours. But the weight of what she had seen was too much for the 13-year-old to bear alone. Brian Howe's body was discovered that evening by local teenagers who were using the wasteland as a shortcut. Their screams pierced the summer air, bringing residents running from all directions. What they found was a scene of such brutality that grown men turned away, vomiting. This was no accident. This was murder. And the mutilations suggested something even more terrifying: a killer who enjoyed inflicting pain. Detective Inspector Dobson arrived at the scene and immediately felt his blood run cold. The marks on the neck, the positioning of the body. It was too similar to Martin Brown. But this time there was no denying the truth. They had a murderer in Scotswood. And given the nature of the wounds, the killer had to be someone small, someone the children would trust. "Get me every statement from the Martin Brown case," Dobson ordered. His team. "And I want to interview every child in this neighborhood, every single one." The investigation that would follow would be unlike anything British law enforcement had ever encountered. Because how do you catch a killer when your prime suspect is barely tall enough to reach a doorknob? Within hours, the neighborhood was swarming with police. Parents clutched their children, refusing to let them out of sight. Fear replaced the summer warmth, turning Scotswood into a community under siege. Everyone was a suspect. Everyone was afraid. But Mary Bell wasn't afraid. She was exhilarated. The next morning, she did something that would ultimately seal her fate. She showed up at the Howe residence and asked Brian's mother if she could see him. "I know he's dead," Mary said with an unsettling calmness. "I just want to see him in his coffin." June Howe, Brian's devastated mother, stared at this blonde child with growing unease. There was something wrong in the way Mary spoke, something off in her casual tone when discussing death. But grief clouded June's judgment, and she assumed the girl was just morbidly curious like many children can be. What June didn't know was that Mary would return again and again over the next few days, each time asking bizarre questions. "Do you miss Brian? Do you cry for him? What did it feel like when you found out he was dead?" These visits would become crucial evidence in the investigation. Detective Dobson was methodical in his approach. He interviewed dozens of children, looking for patterns, inconsistencies, anything that might point to the killer. Most children were scared. Some were crying. All were innocent. But when Mary Bell sat across from him in the interview room, Dobson felt something he had never experienced before. He was looking into the eyes of a child who showed absolutely no fear, no sadness, only curiosity. "Did you know Brian?" Dobson asked gently. "Yes. He's dead." Mary's response was flat, emotionless. "Does that make you sad?" Mary tilted her head, considering the question as if it were an academic exercise. "Should it?" The hairs on Dobson's neck stood up. This wasn't normal childhood processing of trauma. This was something else entirely. He pressed forward with his questions, and Mary answered each one with disturbing precision, sometimes offering details about Brian's death that hadn't been made public. "How did you know about the marks on his body?" Dobson asked carefully. Mary froze for just a second, the first crack in her composed facade. Someone told me." "Who told you, Mary?" "I don't remember." But Dobson did remember. He remembered the notes at the nursery school. He remembered Martin Brown. And now, sitting across from this small blonde girl with the cold blue eyes, he began to understand the horrifying truth. Newcastle's killer wasn't a man. It was a child. Over the next several days, the police worked carefully to build their case. They interviewed Norma Bell extensively, and the terrified teenager began to crack under the pressure. She admitted to being present when Mary showed her Brian's body. She admitted to seeing Mary with scissors. She admitted that Mary had talked about squeezing Martin Brown's throat to see what would happen. When confronted with Norma's statements, Mary's demeanor changed. The innocent child act disappeared, replaced by something calculating and cold. "Norma's lying," Mary stated simply. "She's the one who did it. I tried to stop her." It was a masterful deflection, and it worked partially. Both girls were arrested and charged with murder. But Detective Dobson knew the truth. He had looked into Mary Bell's eyes and seen the absence of something fundamental, something that makes us human. Empathy, remorse, soul. The investigation had its suspects, but the real challenge was just beginning. How do you prosecute an 11-year-old girl for murder? How do you make a jury believe that a child, a little girl, could commit such unspeakable acts? And most terrifyingly of all, what do you do with a killer who hasn't even reached puberty? The trial that would follow would captivate the world and force society to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes, Evil doesn't wait until adulthood to emerge. December 5th, 1968. The Newcastle Assizes Court was besieged by journalists from around the world. Camera flashes illuminated the gray winter morning as crowds gathered outside, desperate for a glimpse of the impossible. 2 young girls accused of murder. The case had already become a media sensation, with newspapers running sensational headlines daily. Child killers. The face of evil. Too young to hang, too dangerous to free. Inside the courtroom, special accommodations had been made for the defendants. Mary Bell, now 11 years old, and Norma Bell, 13, sat in chairs specifically brought in because the standard dock was too tall for them to see over. Mary wore a neat blue dress, her blonde hair carefully brushed, looking every bit the innocent schoolgirl. Only her eyes betrayed the truth. Cold, calculating, watching everything with predatory interest. The prosecution, led by the formidable Rudolph Lyons, QC, faced an unprecedented challenge. British law had never seen anything like this. The last execution of a child in Britain had been in 1887, and even then the perpetrator had been 17. How do you convince a jury that this small blonde girl, who needed a cushion to sit properly in her chair, was a cold-blooded killer? Members of the jury, Lyons began, his voice grave and measured. You are about to hear evidence that will shock you to your core. Evidence that will challenge everything you believe about childhood, innocence, and the nature of evil itself. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented the mutilations on Brian Howe's body, the carved M, the scissor wounds, the attempts at castration. Expert witnesses testified that the force and precision required for these injuries indicated intent, not accident. The wounds were deliberate, calculated, sadistic. Dr. Bernard Tomlinson, the pathologist, took the stand with visible discomfort. In my 30 years of forensic medicine, he testified, his voice shaking slightly, I have never seen injuries like these inflicted on a child. The pattern suggests experimentation, as if someone was curious about what would happen. The courtroom fell silent. Several jury members looked visibly ill. Then came the testimony about the nursery school break-in. The notes found on the walls were presented as evidence. I murder so that I may come back. Handwriting experts testified that the writing matched Mary Bell's. The defense argued that it was a prank, a dark joke by a troubled child seeking attention. But combined with everything else, it painted a picture of a girl who not only killed, but boasted about it. Detective Inspector Dobson took the stand and recounted his interviews with Mary. He described her lack of emotion, her inappropriate questions to Brian's mother, her detailed knowledge of the crime scene that only the killer could possess. She showed no remorse, Dobson testified, his professional composure cracking slightly. When I asked her how she felt about Brian's death, she looked at me as if I had asked her opinion on the weather. There was nothing there. No guilt, no sadness, nothing. When Mary Bell took the stand, the courtroom held its collective breath. Here was the moment everyone had been waiting for, to hear from the child herself. Would she break down, confess, show some sign of humanity? Mary did none of those things. Speaking in a clear, confident voice that seemed far too mature for an 11-year-old, Mary denied everything. She claimed Norma had killed both boys and that she had tried to stop her. Her testimony was detailed, almost rehearsed, and delivered without a trace of emotion. Norma squeezed Martin's throat. Mary stated calmly, as if describing a scene from a book. I told her to stop, but she wouldn't listen. She liked watching him struggle. The projection was textbook psychopathy, attributing her own actions and emotions to someone else. But Mary was convincing in her delivery, never wavering, never showing doubt. The cross-examination was brutal. Lyons pressed her on inconsistencies, on her knowledge of details only the killer could know, on her bizarre behavior after the murders. Why did you visit Brian's mother repeatedly after his death? Lyons demanded. I wanted to comfort her, Mary replied, her blue eyes wide and innocent. I felt sorry for her. Did you feel sorry for... Brian? A pause. Just a fraction of a second, but everyone noticed it. Yes, Mary finally answered, but the word rang hollow in the silent courtroom. Then why can't you tell us anything about Brian? What he liked to play? What made him laugh? If you cared about him, surely you remember something. About him as a person? Mary's face remained blank. She couldn't answer because she had never seen Brian Howe as a person. He had been an object, a thing to be controlled and destroyed, and she couldn't fake empathy she had never felt. When Norma Bell took the stand, the contrast couldn't have been more stark. Where Mary was composed and cold, Norma was trembling and terrified. Tears streamed down her face as she recounted what she had witnessed. Mary told me she had done something to Martin, Norma sobbed. She said she had squeezed his neck to see what would happen. She said he went purple and stopped moving. She seemed proud of it. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. The judge called for order. Norma continued, describing how Mary had shown her Brian's body. She had scissors. She was cutting him. I told her to stop, but she said if I told anyone, she would kill. Me too. I believed her. I was so scared. The defense attorney, representing Norma, pressed forward. Why didn't you tell anyone immediately? Because I saw what Mary was capable of. Norma's voice rose in pitch, hysteria creeping in. She killed 2 children. She didn't care. She smiled while doing it. I thought I would be next. The court had ordered psychiatric evaluations of both girls. Dr. Robert Orton, a child psychologist specializing in behavioral disorders, provided testimony that would become pivotal in understanding Mary Bell. Mary Bell exhibits classic signs of psychopathic personality disorder, Dr. Orton testified. She demonstrates a complete lack of empathy, an inability to form genuine emotional connections, and a predatory approach to other human beings. Most disturbing is her inability to distinguish between right and wrong on an emotional level. She understands intellectually that killing is wrong, but she feels no emotional weight to that knowledge. Can this be treated? The judge asked, concern evident in his voice. Dr. Orton hesitated. In children this young, the research is limited. But I must be honest. I have never encountered a case this severe. In someone so young, the prognosis is uncertain at best. He went on to describe Mary's childhood, the abuse and neglect she had suffered at the hands of her mother, the attempted murders disguised as accidents, the complete absence of maternal love or protection. Mary Bell never had a chance to develop normally, Dr. Orton concluded. By the time she was capable of murder, the capacity for empathy and remorse had already been destroyed. We're not looking at a child who became evil. We're looking at a child who was never allowed to develop the mechanisms that prevent such behavior. Mary's defense attorney Harvey Robson, QC, faced an impossible situation. How do you defend the indefensible? His strategy was to emphasize Mary's traumatic childhood, to paint her as a victim of her circumstances rather than a perpetrator of evil. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Robson addressed them. With passion, before you sits not a monster, but a damaged child, a child who has known nothing but abuse, neglect, and violence from the moment she drew her first breath. Can we truly hold an 11-year-old responsible for actions when she was never taught right from wrong? When every adult in her life failed her spectacularly? It was a compelling argument, and several jury members appeared moved. But then the prosecution presented photographs of Brian Howe's mutilated body, and sympathy evaporated like morning dew. As the trial entered its final days, the tension in Newcastle reached a fever pitch. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse daily, split between those who saw Mary as a victim of her circumstances and those who saw her as pure evil that needed to be locked away forever. Inside the courtroom, the final arguments were delivered. The prosecution painted Mary as a cunning, manipulative killer who knew exactly what she was doing and enjoyed every moment of it. The defense portrayed her as a broken child, more to be pitied than punished. The judge's instructions to the jury were unprecedented. "You must decide," he told them gravely, "whether this child acted with malice aforethought, whether, despite her age, she understood the nature and consequences of her actions. This is not a decision to be taken lightly. The eyes of the world are upon us, but more importantly, the future of these young girls rests in your hands." The jury retired to deliberate, leaving the courtroom in agonizing suspense. Hours passed, then days. What could possibly be taking so long? End of Block 3. The world waited with bated breath. Would justice prevail? Or would a child slip through the cracks of a legal system never designed to handle someone like Mary Bell? And perhaps, most frighteningly, what do you do with a killer who, by all medical and psychological accounts, may never be capable of remorse or rehabilitation? The answer would come soon, and it would shock everyone. December 17th, 1968. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury filed back into the courtroom. The tension was suffocating. Mary Bell sat motionless, her face an unreadable mask. Norma Bell sobbed quietly beside her lawyer. The gallery was packed beyond capacity, with spectators standing shoulder to shoulder, desperate to witness this historic moment. The foreman of the jury stood, a middle-aged man, whose face showed the strain of the decision he was about to announce. His hands trembled slightly as he held the verdict slip. "On the charge of murdering Martin George Brown, how do you find the defendant, Mary Flora Bell?" A pause that seemed to stretch for eternity. "Guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility." The courtroom erupted. Shouts, gasps, the sound of reporters scrambling for the exits to call their newsrooms. The judge's gavel cracked like thunder, demanding order. "On the charge of murdering Brian Edward Howe, how do you find the defendant, Mary Flora Bell? Guilty of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility." Mary Bell's expression didn't change. Not a flicker of emotion crossed her face. She simply stared ahead, as if the verdict concerned someone else entirely. This absence of reaction was perhaps more chilling than any breakdown or protest would have been. For Norma Bell, the verdict was different. Not guilty on all charges. Norma collapsed in her chair, sobbing with relief and trauma that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She had been present, yes. She had been terrified into silence, yes. But she was not a killer. The jury had seen the difference between a frightened witness and a predator. The judge, Justice Ralph Cusack, faced a decision that would define his career and spark decades of debate about juvenile justice. Britain had abolished the death penalty for minors, and even life imprisonment for a child seemed unconscionable to many. But releasing Mary Bell back into society was equally unthinkable. "Mary Flora Bell," the judge began, his voice heavy with the weight of history, "you have been found guilty of 2 counts of manslaughter. The psychiatric reports paint a picture of a child who has suffered unimaginable abuse and neglect. You are, in many ways, a victim yourself." A murmur of agreement rippled through parts of the gallery. "However," the judge continued, his tone hardening, "you are also extremely dangerous. You have taken 2 innocent lives with what can only be described as calculated cruelty. The mutilations you inflicted on Brian Howe demonstrate a level of sadism that transcends any explanation of mere childhood curiosity or accidental harm." Mary still showed no reaction. She might as well have been listening to a weather report. "Therefore, it is the sentence of this court that you be detained at Her Majesty's pleasure, with no minimum term specified. You will remain in secure accommodation until such time as the authorities deem you are no longer a danger to yourself or others." The sentence was essentially indefinite. Tension. Mary Bell could be held for life, or she could be released when deemed safe. At 11 years old, she became one of Britain's youngest convicted killers, and the question everyone asked was, can someone like Mary Bell ever be rehabilitated? Mary was initially sent to Red Bank Secure Unit, a BI facility designed for troubled youths but wholly unprepared for someone like her. The other children were petty criminals, runaways, troubled teens. Mary Bell was a double killer who showed no remorse. The staff at Red Bank quickly realized they were dealing with something unprecedented. Dr. David Westbury, the facility's chief psychiatrist, began intensive therapy sessions with Mary, attempting to understand the psychology of a child killer. "Tell me about Martin Brown," Dr. Westbury asked during one of their early sessions. "What about him?" Mary's tone was casual, almost bored. "How did you feel when he died?" Mary considered this, her head tilting in that unsettling way she had. "I felt nothing. Should I have felt something? Most people feel sad when someone dies, especially a child. I'm not most people." It was said without arrogance or shame, simply a statement of fact. Dr. Westbury's notes from these sessions would later be published in academic journals, providing unprecedented insight into the mind of a juvenile psychopath. "Mary demonstrates cognitive understanding of emotions," he wrote, "but appears incapable of experiencing them genuinely. She can mimic sadness, anger, or joy when she believes it will benefit her, but the emotions are performative, not authentic. It's like watching an alien try to imitate human behavior." Outside the secure walls of Red Bank, Mary Bell became a cultural phenomenon and a lightning rod for debate. The case spawned thousands of articles, books, and eventually documentaries. Psychologists studied her. Criminologists dissected the case. The public remained divided. One camp argued that Mary was a victim of horrendous abuse who deserved compassion and treatment. "She never had a chance," wrote prominent child advocate Dr. Eleanor Morrison in The Guardian. "Betty Bell destroyed her daughter long before Mary ever killed anyone. We failed this child, and now we're punishing her for our failures." The opposing view was equally passionate. "Evil exists," declared former prosecutor Harold Stevens in a scathing editorial. Mary Bell knew what she was doing. She enjoyed it. She mutilated a 3-year-old child and showed no remorse. Some people cannot be saved, and Mary Bell is one of them. The families of the victims were trapped in their own hell. June Howe, Brian's mother, never recovered from her son's murder. She became a recluse, unable to leave her home without seeing children playing in the streets and remembering her own child's brutal end. When journalists approached her for comments, she would only say, "She took everything from me. Everything." Martin Brown's mother, Rita, died just 4 years after her son's murder, many believing she had died of a broken heart. The grief was simply too much to bear. Mary Bell's time in detention was marked by numerous incidents that demonstrated she remained dangerous. In 1970, just 2 years into her sentence, she attempted to strangle another girl at the facility. The attack was interrupted by staff, but it confirmed everyone's worst fears. Mary hadn't changed. She did it the same way she killed Martin. The victim, a 14-year-old named Sarah, name changed for privacy, later told authorities. "She came up behind me and just started squeezing, and she was smiling. That's what I remember most. She was smiling." Mary was moved to a more secure facility, but the pattern continued. She was manipulative, prone to violent outbursts when she didn't get her way, and showed a disturbing fascination with true crime, particularly cases involving children. In 1977, at age 20, Mary and another inmate escaped from Moore Court Open Prison, where she had been transferred as part of a rehabilitation program. The escape sparked a massive manhunt and public panic. "Child killer on the loose!" screamed the tabloid headlines. For 3 days, Britain held its breath. Parents kept their children inside. Police scoured the countryside. And Mary Bell was free, experiencing something she hadn't known since childhood: complete autonomy. Mary and her fellow escapee were found in a seedy motel on the outskirts of Blackpool. They hadn't committed any new crimes during their brief freedom, a fact that some pointed to as evidence of rehabilitation. Others argued they simply hadn't had time. Upon her return, Mary was subjected to intense psychiatric evaluation. Dr. Westbury, who had continued to monitor her case, noted something interesting in his reports. Mary has learned to mimic remorse convincingly. She says the right things, makes the appropriate facial expressions, even produces tears on command. But when pushed beyond the surface, when asked to describe specific emotional experiences, she reverts to abstract, textbook descriptions. It's like asking a blind person to describe colors. They can repeat what they've been told, but they cannot truly comprehend. Yet something had changed, even if it wasn't genuine emotion. Mary had developed a survival instinct that mimicked rehabilitation. She began to understand that showing appropriate behavior was the key to eventual freedom. She participated in therapy, took educational courses, and carefully constructed a persona of a reformed young woman haunted by childhood trauma. "I think about those boys every day," Mary told a parole board in 1980. Her voice perfectly modulated with just the right amount of tremor. "I wish I could take it back. I wish I had been strong enough to resist the darkness inside me." It was a compelling performance, and it worked. May 1980. After 12 years in detention, Mary Bell was released on license at the age of 23. The decision sparked outrage across Britain. Protests erupted outside the Home Office. Victims' rights groups demanded answers. How could a double child murderer be released after just 12 years? The Home Secretary defended the decision in Parliament. Mary Bell was 11 years old when she committed these crimes. She has spent her entire adolescence in secure facilities, undergoing extensive therapy and rehabilitation. Our psychiatric experts believe she is no longer a danger to society. We cannot, as a civilized nation, imprison someone indefinitely for crimes committed as a child without offering the possibility of redemption. But was Mary Bell truly reformed, or had she simply learned to manipulate the system? The psychiatrists themselves were divided. Some genuinely believed she had changed. Others warned that psychopathy doesn't disappear. It just learns to hide better. Upon release, Mary Bell was given a new identity, a fresh start that victims' families found unconscionable. "She gets to start over?" June Howe asked reporters through tears. "Brian doesn't get to start over. He doesn't get a new identity. He's dead, and she's free." Mary disappeared into British society under her new name, protected by lifelong anonymity orders. Where she went, what she did, who she became, these remain guarded secrets to this day. But the question lingered: can someone like Mary Bell ever truly be free? Or is she forever haunted by the ghosts of two little boys, whose lives she extinguished? The story seemed to be over, but for Mary Bell and for Britain, it was far from finished. The years would bring new revelations, shocking developments, and a twist that no one could have predicted. The child killer was out in the world, and the nightmare was about to, enter a new, even more disturbing chapter. For years, Mary Bell vanished into anonymity, protected by one of Britain's most stringent court orders. The press was forbidden from revealing her new identity, her location, or even her general whereabouts. She was a ghost, a monster that had disappeared into the fabric of ordinary society. But in 1984, just 4 years after her release, a bombshell revelation would shatter the carefully constructed facade of her rehabilitation. Mary Bell had given birth to a daughter. The news sent shockwaves through Britain when it was leaked to the press, though her identity remained protected. "Child killer is now a mother," screamed the Daily Mail headline. The public reaction was visceral and immediate. How could the authorities allow someone who had murdered children to raise a child of her own? What kind of mother could Mary Bell possibly? Child Protection Services were immediately involved, monitoring the situation closely. Social workers made regular visits, psychologists evaluated Mary's parenting, and the debate raged in Parliament and on television talk shows across the nation. "This is unconscionable," declared victims. Rights advocate Margaret Harrison on BBC's Question Time. "Mary Bell strangled and mutilated children. Now we're supposed to trust her with an innocent baby? What happens when that child cries too much, when it misbehaves? Will Mary's reformed nature hold, or will we have another dead child on our hands?" hands. Others argued for Mary's right to redemption. She was a child herself when these crimes occurred, countered Dr. James Patterson, a child psychologist. She has served her time, undergone extensive rehabilitation, and deserves the chance to build a normal life. Denying her motherhood is cruel and serves no purpose. Mary's daughter, whom we'll call Emma to protect her identity, grew up never knowing her mother's horrific past. Mary had made the decision early on to keep the truth hidden, constructing an elaborate fiction about her childhood and background. Emma knew her mother as quiet, reserved, sometimes emotionally distant, but never suspected the darkness that lurked beneath. Friends and neighbors who knew Mary under her new identity described her as unremarkable. She was just normal, one neighbor recalled years later when the truth finally emerged. A bit standoffish maybe, but not in a creepy way. She kept to herself, raised her daughter, worked ordinary jobs. If you had told me who she really was, I would have never believed it. But beneath that normalcy, questions lingered. Did Mary truly love her daughter? Or was Emma just another manipulation? A prop in Mary's performance of rehabilitation? Those who monitored the situation remained divided. Dr. Westbury, who continued to review Mary's case file periodically, noted in a confidential report from 1987, Mary demonstrates appropriate maternal behaviors, feeding, clothing, ensuring education, and health care. However, the emotional connection appears shallow. She goes through the motions of motherhood with the same performative quality she shows with other emotions. The question remains, is she genuinely bonded with her child, or is she simply acting out a role she believes is expected of her? 14 years after Emma's birth, journalist Gita Serini published Cries Unheard, The Story of Mary Bell, a comprehensive and controversial biography based on extensive interviews with Mary herself. The book was explosive, revealing details about Mary's horrific childhood that had never been fully disclosed during the trial. Sereni's research uncovered the true depths of Betty Bell's abuse. Mary had been sexually abused from infancy, possibly even offered to pedophiles by her own mother in exchange for money or drugs. She had been force-fed pills as a baby, suffered accidents that were likely murder attempts, and grew up in an environment of such sustained trauma that her psychological development had been fundamentally warped. By the age of 4, Serini wrote, Mary Bell had experienced more trauma than most people endure in a lifetime. She was a child whose capacity for empathy had been systematically destroyed before she could even form coherent memories. The book humanized Mary in a way that enraged the victims' families. June Howe, now elderly and still grieving, spoke publicly for the first time in years. I don't care what happened to her. Nothing justifies what she did to my Brian. That book is trying to make her a victim, but the real victims are buried in the ground. What made the controversy even worse was the revelation that Mary had been paid for her cooperation with the book, reportedly around $50,000, though the exact figure was never confirmed. The public was outraged. Blood money, the tabloid screamed. Mary Bell had profited from her crimes. The publicity surrounding Sereni's book created an impossible situation. Emma was now 14 years old, the same age as some of her mother's potential classmates would have been during the murders. Kids at school began whispering. Someone's older sibling recognized details from news coverage. And then, inevitably, Emma discovered the truth about who her mother really was. The exact circumstances of this discovery remain private, protected by the same court orders that shield their identities. But those close to the situation described it as catastrophic. Imagine being 14 years old and discovering that your mother, the woman who packed your lunches and helped with your homework, had murdered 2 children when she was barely older than you. Emma's psychological trauma was immense. She underwent intensive therapy, struggling to reconcile the mother she knew with the monster described in newspaper archives. Some reports suggested she attempted suicide. Others claim she tried to run away. What is known is that the relationship between mother and daughter became strained in ways that might never fully heal. Social services intensified their monitoring, fearful that the stress might trigger something dangerous in Mary. But to everyone's surprise, or perhaps to the vindication of those who believed in her rehabilitation, Mary remained stable. She focused on supporting her daughter through the crisis, even as her own carefully constructed life crumbled around her. In 2003, recognizing the unprecedented nature of the situation, the High Court granted Mary Bell and her daughter a lifetime anonymity order. It was the first time such an order had been extended to protect a convicted criminal rather than a victim. The ruling stated that revealing their identities or whereabouts would put them at serious risk of vigilante violence. The decision was met with fury from victims' rights groups and sections of the media. "She murdered children and now she gets special protection?" demanded one tabloid editor. "What about the protection Martin and Brian deserved?" But the court held firm. Justice Dame Elizabeth Butler Sloss explained the reasoning. "While we cannot condone the terrible crimes committed, Mary Bell was herself a child when they occurred. She has served her sentence and has a right to attempt rehabilitation. More importantly, her daughter is completely innocent and deserves protection from the consequences of crimes she had no part in." The anonymity order was so strict that anyone who revealed information that could lead to Mary's identification could face imprisonment. It remains in effect to this day, one of the most comprehensive protection orders in British legal history. Today, Mary Bell would be in her late 60s. She lives somewhere in Britain under an assumed identity, protected by lifelong anonymity. She is reportedly a grandmother now, though whether Emma maintained a relationship with her mother remains unknown and protected by the court order. Those few who have encountered her in recent years, social workers, psychiatrists conducting mandatory check-ins, describe a woman who is quiet, reclusive, and deeply private. She works ordinary jobs, lives an ordinary life, and to all outward appearances has never reoffended. But the question that haunts everyone who knows the case is the same question that has lingered for over 50 years. Did Mary Bell truly change, or did she simply become better at hiding her true nature? Dr. Westbury, now retired, reflected on this in his final report on the case in 2015. "I have studied Mary Bell for over 40 years. I have interviewed her, analyzed her, watched her grow from a child into an elderly woman. And I still cannot answer with certainty whether she is genuinely reformed or simply an exceptionally skilled manipulator who learned to play the long game. Perhaps both can be true simultaneously. Perhaps she has created a false self so convincingly that even she believes in it. While Mary Bell lives in protected anonymity, the families of Martin Brown and Brian Howe never received such mercy. June Howe died in 2019, having spent 51 years grieving her son. She never forgave Mary Bell, never accepted the narrative of rehabilitation, and died believing that justice had failed her. Martin Brown's family has been equally devastated across generations. His sister, who was only a toddler when Martin was killed, grew up in the shadow of his murder. "I never knew my brother," she told a journalist in 2018, her identity protected. "But his death defined our entire family. My mother never recovered. My father drank himself to death. And somewhere out there, the person who destroyed us all gets to live a normal life, under a new name. How is that justice?" Every year on the anniversaries of the murders, flowers appear at the small memorials for Martin and Brian in Newcastle. The neighborhood of Scotswood has changed dramatically. The slums have been cleared, new housing built, the physical scars erased. But the psychological scars remain. As the decades have passed, the case of Mary Bell has transcended the specifics of the crimes and become a broader question about justice, rehabilitation, and the nature of evil itself. Can a child be truly evil, or are they simply damaged beyond repair? If someone commits horrific acts as a child, do they deserve a second chance as an adult? How do we balance the rights of victims with the possibility of redemption? And most troubling of all, how many Mary Bells are out there right now, children being so severely abused that they're becoming the next generation of monsters? These questions remain unanswered, debated in universities, courtrooms, and family dinner tables across the world. The case has influenced juvenile justice systems globally, sparked countless studies on childhood psychology, and forced societies to confront uncomfortable truths about what we do to our most vulnerable members. 2018 marked the 50th anniversary of the murders that traumatized Britain. As commemorative articles appeared in newspapers and documentaries aired on television, something unexpected happened. New witnesses came forward. People who had been children in 1968, now elderly themselves, began sharing stories they had kept silent for half a century. What they revealed was chilling. A woman named Patricia Reynolds, now 68 years old, contacted the BBC with a story that made investigators' blood run cold. In the summer of 1967, a full year before Martin Brown's murder, Patricia had been playing in the same Scotswood wasteland where Brian Howe would later be killed. She was 7 years old at the time. Mary Bell tried to strangle me, Patricia revealed in a trembling voice during a recorded interview. She came up behind me while I was playing alone and put her hands around my throat. I couldn't breathe. I thought I was going to die. Then some older kids came around the corner, and she let go and ran away. Patricia's mother had reported the incident to police at the time, but in the chaos of Scotswood's rough streets, where children fought and played rough constantly, it had been dismissed as kids being kids. The report had been filed away and forgotten, until now. If someone had listened, Patricia said, tears streaming down her weathered face, Martin and Brian might still be alive. Mary had already tried to kill. She was practicing. Patricia's revelation opened the floodgates. Over the following months, at least 6 other individuals came forward with similar stories, children who had been attacked by Mary Bell between 1966 and 1968, whose parents had reported the incidents, but which were never connected or taken seriously. One man, David Morrison, described an incident from 1967 when Mary had pushed him off a garage roof, resulting in a broken arm. She climbed up there, with me, smiled, and then just pushed. When adults came running, she said I had slipped. They believed her because she looked so innocent. Another woman recalled Mary trying to feed her pills that she claimed were sweets during a birthday party. My mom caught her and got angry, but Mary said she was just playing pretend. Looking back now, knowing what happened to Martin and Brian, those might have been the same pills her mother used to drug her. Mary was trying to kill me. The pattern was undeniable. Mary Bell hadn't suddenly become a killer in 1968. She had been building up to it. For years, experimenting, learning, perfecting her technique. And every adult who could have stopped her had failed to see the warning signs. Dr. Sarah Chen, a criminal psychologist who reviewed these new testimonies in 2019, published a startling analysis. What we're seeing is the developmental trajectory of a serial killer. Mary Bell exhibited predatory behavior from at least age 9, possibly earlier. The murders of Martin Brown and Brian Howe weren't isolated incidents. They were the culmination of years of escalating violence. Had she not been caught, there would have been more. Victims, many more. But the most shocking revelation came from an unexpected source. In 2020, a former social worker named Helen Garrett came forward with a deathbed confession from Betty Bell, Mary's mother, who had died in 2019. Betty, ravaged by decades of drug abuse and alcoholism, had been in a hospice receiving end-of-life care when she asked to speak with Garrett privately. What she revealed was monstrous. She told me she knew, Garrett recounted in a sealed testimony that was later leaked to the press. Betty knew what Mary was doing. She said Mary had told her about hurting Martin. Brown and Betty didn't report it. She said she thought Mary was just making up stories for attention. But it was worse than mere neglect. According to Garrett, Betty claimed that she had actually encouraged Mary's violent tendencies as a way to toughen her up for the cruel world. She had allegedly told young Mary that weak people deserve what they get, and that only the strong survive. Betty Bell created a monster, Dr. Chen stated after reviewing the testimony. She didn't just fail to stop Mary, she actively cultivated the very traits that made her a killer. The abuse, the attempted murders disguised as accidents, the encouragement of violence. Betty Bell destroyed her daughter's humanity systematically and deliberately. The revelation cast the entire case in a new, even more tragic light. Mary Bell wasn't just a child who snapped. She was a child who had been, carefully, if unconsciously, groomed into a killer by her own mother. The new revelation sparked a cold case review by Northumbria Police. Detectives began examining unsolved deaths and disappearances of children in Newcastle and surrounding areas between 1965 and 1968. What they found was troubling. 3 children had died in accidents during this period that bore suspicious similarities to Mary's known methods. A 5-year-old boy who fell from a railway bridge in 1966, a 4-year-old girl who was found drowned in a shallow pond in 1967, despite being a strong swimmer, a 6-year-old who died from accidental strangulation on a playground in early 1968. Could Mary Bell have been responsible for these deaths as well? The evidence was circumstantial at best. She lived in the area, she had no alibis, and the methods matched her known patterns. But without concrete proof, and with Mary protected by anonymity orders, no charges could be brought. Detective Inspector Thomas Bradford, who led the cold case review, stated in a 2021 press conference, "We cannot definitively link Mary Bell to these additional deaths. However, the similarities are concerning enough that we cannot rule out the possibility. The truth is, we may never know the full extent of the damage she caused." Through her legal representatives, Mary Bell declined to comment on any of the new allegations. The anonymity order prevented journalists from confronting her directly, and she made no public statements. Her silence was interpreted differently by different groups. Supporters argued that she had served her time and had no obligation to relitigate the past. Mary Bell was a child when these crimes occurred, her solicitor stated. She has cooperated fully with authorities for over 50 years, undergone extensive rehabilitation, and poses no current threat to society. These new allegations are unsubstantiated and appear designed to victimize her all over again. Critics saw her silence as confirmation of guilt. If she's truly reformed and remorseful, argued June Howe's daughter, speaking publicly for the first time, why won't she answer these questions? Why won't she help bring closure to other families who may have lost children to her? Her silence speaks volumes. Today, the case of Mary Bell remains one of the most controversial and studied cases in criminal psychology. Universities around the world use it as a case study in childhood trauma, psychopathy, and the limits of rehabilitation. The question, "What do we do with child killers?" continues to divide legal scholars, psychologists, and the public. The impact on juvenile justice has been profound. Many countries reformed their laws regarding child offenders because of this case. Treatment programs for severely disturbed children were developed. Warning sign checklists were created to help identify potentially dangerous children before they harm others. But perhaps the most important legacy is the conversation the case sparked about child abuse and neglect. Mary Bell's childhood was so horrific that it forced society to confront how we protect, or fail to protect, our most vulnerable. Mary Bell should have been saved, Dr. Chen reflected in her 2023 book, The Making of a Child Killer. Before she killed anyone, she was a victim who needed rescue. Every adult in her life failed her. Her mother, her father, teachers, social workers, neighbors. By the time she murdered Martin Brown, it was already too late. The real crime is that we allow children like Mary to fall through the cracks until they become monsters, and then we act surprised when the inevitable happens. On a gray November morning in Newcastle 2025, flowers still appear at the small memorial for Martin Brown and Brian Howe. Local residents, many too young to remember the original crimes, pause to read the plaques that mark where innocents died over half a century ago. Somewhere in Britain, Mary Bell lives under an assumed name, her true identity known only to a handful of officials, and those bound by court orders. She is now 68 years old. She may be a grandmother watching children play in a park, a checkout clerk at a supermarket, a quiet neighbor who keeps to herself. She could be anyone, anywhere. And that's what makes the story of Mary Bell so terrifying and so tragic. She represents the ultimate question about human nature. Are people born evil, or are they made that way? And if they're made that way, can they be unmade? Dr. Westbury, in his final interview before his death in 2024, offered this chilling conclusion. I spent 40 years trying to understand Mary Bell. I interviewed her dozens of times. I analyzed every aspect of her psychology. And at the end of my life, I can tell you with certainty only this. Mary Bell learned to survive by becoming whatever people needed her to be. In her childhood, that meant becoming violent to protect herself. In detention, that meant becoming compliant to secure release. In freedom, that means becoming invisible to maintain her anonymity. Who Mary Bell really is beneath all those masks, I don't think even she knows anymore. And perhaps that's the most tragic part of all. Martin George Brown would have been 61 years old today. He might have been a grandfather himself, living a quiet life in Newcastle, or perhaps having moved away to pursue dreams we'll never know about. He was robbed of every birthday, every Christmas, every moment of joy or sorrow that makes up a human life. Brian Edward Howe would have been 60. His mother carried a photograph of him until the day she died, the image forever frozen at age 3. Smiling little boy who never got the chance to grow old. Their stories ended in 1968, but their absence echoes through generations. Siblings who grew up in the shadow of their deaths, parents who died of broken hearts, communities that lost their innocence. And somewhere, Mary Bell continues to live with her secrets, her memories, and the blood of 2 innocent children that can never be washed away, no matter how many decades pass or how many identities she assumes. The case is closed. The files are sealed. The killer walks free under a protected identity. But justice for Martin Brown and Brian Howe remains forever out of reach. This concludes the 6-block investigative criminal story of Mary Bell, one of Britain's most notorious and controversial child killers. The case continues to spark debate about justice, rehabilitation, and the nature of evil itself, questions that may never have satisfying answers.